And we will go back to Plamondon again. You will think I have a fixation on him, but he's an interesting case. And he had made a painting we call The Last of the Hurons, that you may have seen reproduced maybe in the magazine or something. Anyway, it's not completely unknown. Le Dernier des Hurons, 1838. And it's in a private collection of Mr. Fred Schaeffer in Toronto. And I will tell you how it ends up there, but let's put it first to have some notes about this representation. Okay, so it's a painting painted in Quebec City in 1838 by Plamondon, and if you go to the reverse side of the picture, you will have an inscription there who describe a little bit who is the model. And he gave his name, Zachary Vincent, V-I-N-C-A-N-T, Zachary Vincent. And he says he had the reputation to be the last of the Hurons of Lorette. Lorette is a little village near Quebec City, outside of Quebec City, where you have indeed a Huron community up to this day, in fact. And the idea will be that maybe he's not the very last of one, but last of pure blood, pure Huron blood, if you want. That was more or less the implication there. He says that he's age 23 years old. And when you look at the picture, it's a little bit hard to believe if he's the last of the Huron, or if he's a Huron Indian. One thing seems evident, that Plamondon have not stressed too much the clues by which you could recognize an Indian at the time. Say if you compare, for instance, paintings who are already famous of Paul Kane, let's say in Canada, or George Catlin in the United States, they have already established the stereotype as we know it, with feathers and with kind of caribou deerskin coat, and with the ornamentation with beads and things like that. You have nothing of that in a way. And if you look at his face, you could maybe think, well, maybe he's an Italian, or I see him as a Napolitan a little bit, or as a Portuguese or something, maybe south of Europe. But as if Plamondon didn't want to stress too much the clues by which you could recognize him as an Indian. And if you compare him to representation almost contemporary, this painting is of 1840, so it's 2 years after, let's say, and representing also Indians of Lorette. So the same tribe, they look very different. They look, in the contrary, there you have the impression that they have accumulated all these signs of Indianity, if you want. This second painting on the right there is done by a man called Henry Thielke, Thielcke. He was from German origin, Thielke, and but apparently make his studies in England. So and he came in Canada for a short period, and you guess what? He succeeded to fight with Plamondon, or Plamondon succeeded to fight with him. This is so typical of the type of relationship of Plamondon with anybody getting on his turf that it's not so surprising. What happened? He painted once a religious picture. They still can make a baptism of Christ. That Plamondon find, of course, horrible because it was in his specific field. He wanted to have I would say, to have the upper control of portrait and also of religious picture. So the moment there's another painter who tried to do that, there's always a competition. So what Plamondon did, he did what he did. If you remember the first lecture I give you a few examples of that. He did the same thing here. He made a description so ridiculous of the painting of Thielke that meaning that this man doesn't know how to paint. He says that the St. John the Baptist have a very inconvenient pose because he put his arm like this on his hips and seems to baptize the Christ as if it was, okay, a little bit of water, and that's it, with a big smile and all that. This is ridiculous. How can you do that? And he says also that the dove above, you know that in the baptism of Christ, habitually you have the dove. And he says there's only one little ray of light that comes from it, And he said, anybody can guess what it make you think about. And so really demolishing the painting. Apparently, the two guys were living near together, one on Desjardins Street and the other on Buade Street in Quebec. This is, again, these streets are very, very close indeed, are in front, if you want, of the Cathedral of Quebec. There's a little place there, and it's 2 streets nearby there. So they were not fighting, but they were insulting each other each time they saw on the street. You see, they were even challenging one the other. I'm a better painter than you. A little bit like 2 roosters. Anyway, the painting of Thielke that I want to compare there is interesting. In a way, the full title of it could read something like the solemn reception of a chief newly elected. And indeed, if you look at it, you see there's a personage who seems to be more important in the middle here. And then you have all these Indians around him with very much in full attire, I would say, with the kind of top hat, and then also with their sash and their kind of all the jewels in silver like this. They are really well dressed. Some of them could be identified. I will show you an example of that. Let's see if I put a lithograph that was done from that painting. It's exactly the same subject. And on the back of it, if you look, you have somebody who is very good for the historian, who have identified all the personages that we see here. Some of them, like the chief here on the right, is Nicolas Vincent. He's a very well-known chief of the Huron community at the time. And others are also, could be identified one by one. I don't think it's so important here. The newly elected chief there is, in fact, a man that was not an Indian, but was, let's say, important for them. It was Robert Symes. He was a justice. He was, let's say, in control of the law at the time. And when the cholera came in Quebec in 1834, apparently he have helped a lot the Indian community to protect them or give them advice, I don't know. So they wanted to thank him, and they wanted to receive him in their tribe. And that's why he's sitting here in the middle, the only non-Indian, if you want, of the whole composition, but costume like everybody else. Like he received also all the medals and all the silvers and everything, like the others. And one thing to make a connection with our painting of Plamondon, it is this personage that you see here, the only one who has feathers on his head, so that's kind of more traditional type of hat, if you want. This one here in behind is Zachary Vincent. It's the same that Plamondon have painted. So in fact, even if the two paintings looks very different, they have this connection. The same personage is in both. And let's say to make his painting, how they could do it, you see, the ceremony there happened in 1838. And the painting is 1840, so that means 2 years after. It's not really a reportage, what Thielke saw. It was a reconstruction. And the ceremony happens in the end of February, so during the winter. So normally the people will not be standing like this outside. And we know by description of the ceremony of the time that in fact it was done indoor, and that there was a huge kettle there with soup, you see. So I guess the only thing that is left there, it is this kind of cloud behind there who hide the landscape. It's a lot of cloud, it's a lot of vapor for soup. But anyway, yeah, I guess it's the only thing that's remnant there. And then it means that Thielke, to make his painting, had to use some sources to be able to construct it, because he was not in front of the people when he painted it. And you could imagine who commissioned the painting. It's probably Robert Symes himself, that wanted to have a souvenir of the ceremony. So if you, for instance, you could compare engraving of that time, like this one done by Chatfield, of one of the chief with this one, for instance. As if he took from previous engraving some model to build little by little all the personages of his composition. The only one it could be quite easy to get and was available, it was probably Robert Symes. But the others use engravings and, oh, I'm sorry, I will go back. You have the other one here where you have 3 of these chiefs, and this one is called Romain, Nicolas Romain, I think. And it is him, of course, that have lent his body to Robert Symes. The only thing was different is the head, but the rest of the posture, let's see, the way it's dressed, comes from this engraving. What it was, it's done in England, these engravings. It was chiefs that went to England to make some representation with the king of the time, which was George IV. And so they were received by the king, their portraits were painted there, and then they make engravings of that, and they were distributed all over, even in Canada. So that's the type of material with whom painters could reconstruct a scene. Okay, so let's go back to the costume of our Zachary Vincent by Plamondon, and I will show you back again in a few minutes. I think if you compare the costume that we saw in Thielke's work, and if you look at this Krieghoff picture, you feel that it's closer to Krieghoff in a way. That's probably what Plamondon wanted to show. It is not a costume d'apparat, it's something like for special occasion, but more the regular costume of these Indians. Let's say with like you see here, you see, okay, they are now the hunters according to, with snowshoes, but let's see, if you take only this upper part, you could say, well, the costume of the last of the Hurons is quite close to this one. So you see, if you compare both, it seems to be more or less the same type of material, if you want, the same color also, the opposition between the white and red. So maybe at the time, there was clues were easier for the people of the time to read than to us. For instance, there's at least 3 details here that could, for somebody of the 19th century, identify this man as an Indian. The first one is the brooch that he have here. I want to show you one example of this. These were silver done for trades. Instead of paying the Indians for their fur, for instance, with money, they were exchanging it with the silver's ornament. This one, we know even who did it, because there is a kind of little indication on the silver itself. You have 2 letters, let's say J and T, and it's Jonathan Tyler, who was one of the silversmiths of the time that did a lot of this type of works, you see. They were used almost as a kind of money, as a kind of exchange, if you want. And so you see him in his neck here, he have a brooch quite similar to that. I have other example just to give you an idea that how many type there was, how many variation on this, but it was really linked to the fur trade. It was a way to pay them, and it was used by the Indian as ornament after. So and most of them are in silver, so meaning they have a certain even material value in that sense, and I guess they could appreciate also the decoration or whatever the motif that was used for that. The other element also is typical of Indian at the time is the sash. It's maybe paradoxical because we associate the sash to the French-Canadian rebel of 1837. They are supposed to go with this, but apparently it's a thing that they borrowed from Indians, and we don't know exactly the origin of it, but it seems that tribes who used to have a kind of method to make, how do you say, tresse? Yeah. Who have this technique already could make sash like this. It was not too, it was like a possible development of that. And okay, I have one example here. So that's what he wear, of course, around his waist. And you have few examples here with color, some with beads, some more ornated than the others. These examples come from Hurons, and so are very, I guess this one is very close to the one that he's wearing here. And the third element is, of course, the knife. Maybe we don't see it too much, but it's here on his side. He have a knife. So with these three elements, I guess somebody of the time could have guessed that this is a portrait of the last of the Hurons. So anyway, whatever was the signification, let's say, of the painting, let's see what happened to it. So when Plamondon did that, he was busy with the famous way of the cross that I showed you two lecture ago. You remember this project that he had for Notre Dame Church. So the idea was to make a portrait that will be that will attract attention in order that during the time that he's doing this huge painting for the church, he will not be forgotten as a portraitist. You understand that was his plan. And it worked very well, because not only the portrait win him a medal through a society was called la Société littéraire et historique du Québec, and more familiarly, littéraire, lit. It was a society of collectors, of also of artists, very mixed also, English and French, and it was like the intelligentsia, I would say, of Quebec City at the time. They were distributing medals like this to artists, and that was one of the things that Tilke wanted to do. You see, let's make a competition between both of us, let's send a painting to the lit, and we will see which is the best painter. That's one of the things that he wanted to do. So Plamondon sent his painting to the lit and got a medal, and he was very proud of this, you can imagine. More than that, he succeeded to sell his painting to a very famous man, to Lord Durham. So Lord Durham was visiting Canada at the time, and for a very famous report, as you know. And he went, how he could see the painting of Plamondon, because at the time, the studio of Plamondon was in the Parliament. There was, I guess the Parliament, what they did was too big for their usage. God knows that ours is not big enough, anyway, for all politicians. But in the time, I guess, they had a too big parliament, so they rented some studio to artists. And that's why, of course, a man like Durham could go, oh, why not you are here, why not to visit the studio of Monsieur Plamondon, you have a painting to show you. And he decided, this is very good for my collection in England, I will go back with it. And I will be able to show it to friends and things. Look how the Indians of Canada looks like, or whatever his motivation. So first, he got a medal. Secondly, he sell it. And thirdly, there was the journalist of the time become to speak of the event, because if such an important man like Durham buy the painting, there must be some interest to it, you could imagine. And of course, one of the guys who wrote an article is Plamondon himself. He didn't sign it, but I'm sure it's him who wrote it, because it was full of praise for the painting. He says, what a fantastic representation of the last of the Hurons that Monsieur Plamondon have painted. Look at his meditative face looking in the sky like this instead, and having a kind of feeling of resignation in front of his fate, and that's explained, of course, his kind of crossed arm like this. He doesn't seem too active, and he says he's beautifully dressed in the typical dress of the costume, let's say, of these people. And finally, you see him in this forest he's the man of the forest, so Plamondon have also put that. And in fact, he's describing, I would say, the four elements that you have in any portrait of that type that could be described this way. You have first the physiognomy, what is expressed in the face of the personage. Here, evidently, it's not aggressive. It's somebody who is rather meditative, if you want, or a little bit lost in his thought and looking vaguely toward heaven, let's see, instead of looking at the onlooker, for instance, at us. Then the other element is pathognomy, meaning the posture, how he present himself, how his body stand, let's see. Here, evidently, he crossed his arm like this, and then it could be an expression of resignation. Certainly not of action. He doesn't threaten anybody. He's like this and looking even. And then I would say the two other factors is dress and address. Dress, how he's dressed, how he's presented, and address, where he is. So the fact that he's outside, that he's not in a building, the fact that he's presented in the forest also will make sense for what Plamondon wanted to say. But then Plamondon in his article adds an element which is very important. He says, okay, how Plamondon have described very well the last of the Hurons. And he said, these sons of freedom who are now disappearing from our sight like a vanishing race. And he says, like the beavers of our lake and the moose of our forest are disappearing also. And maybe as us, meaning French-Canadian, will disappear in turn in front of a stronger nation. Okay. Why he said that? Because you are in 1840. Think a little bit, you are 3 years after the rebellion of 1837. So in French Canada, the mood was rather depressed because this rebellion who could have maybe brought something was crushed. And not only that, Durham, who was, after all, a Whig in England, and raised a lot of hope that he will take the side of the French-Canadian. In the contrary, suggested in his famous report, the union of the two Canada, meaning, if you want, the assimilation of the French to the English. Basically, it was perceived like that, let's say, by the French-Canadian at the time. So they thought that we can like the doomed nation too. We could be like the Huron. And this is the key, I think, of this painting. It's not an ethnographic painting. It is a symbolically historical painting. What Plamondon wants to represent is not le dernier des Hurons. It is the fate of the French, of the possible fate of the French-Canadian. He used the Indian as a kind of identification figure. And you will see he's not the only one at the time. I have others examples that I will show you where you get this kind of feeling. When you put it in the context of the time, it makes sense. The Indians are seen as a way, you could make a reflection on their fate as being maybe what the French-Canadian could expect also coming to them. I tell you, the mood at the time was rather depressed. So anyway, the painting goes out of Canada. As I told you, Lord Durham finished his report and he go back to London. And then the painting disappeared for any reason that I could imagine, up to 1832. Nobody knows really what it is. We know it's in England, but we don't know really where. And nobody also looked too much. In 1932, this is a little bit after the crash, of course, the Earls of Durham have some financial problems and decide to sell their collection. So this painting was sold at the time in 1932, and then a little bit later to an English collector, I don't know his name. And then a little bit later, Fred Schaefer from Toronto bought the painting and brought it back in Canada. Not in Quebec, but at least in Toronto, at least in Canada. That's why it's still there in his collection. He's a very nice man. I met him and he says, oh, voulez-vous rencontrer Monsieur Zachary Vincent? Yes, I want to see it in the flesh. And he had it in his collection. So that's a little bit, let's say, the story of that picture. But what I want to stress, it is the meaning of it. It's not an ethnological picture. It's not really an anthropological picture. It's more a symbolic one in which you use the other as a kind of screen, if you want it, where you project your thing. And then maybe we could make a little bit of psychoanalysis to understand what's happening. It's a phenomenon of identification with the others. Okay, you have two periods that you have to be aware of the relationship between the French and the Indians. Before the conquest, before the English conquest, before 1760, the relation between the French and the Indians is rather good. There are fights with the Iroquois and all this, but it's rather good for two reasons. First of all, I would say a military reason, because they make association with the Indians in order to protect the colony against the British in the south. So there's a military reason for that. And the other is economic, because the colony lived basically on fur trade. And the big provider of furs are the Indians. So you could say during the French regime, there was a rather good relationship with them. After the conquest, suddenly the things changed completely. First of all, military reason you don't have anymore, because you don't have to fight the English. They are there, they are everywhere. It's over. They have conquered, and there's no military reason to keep this kind of link with the Indians from the French-Canadian part, I understand. The other one is economic too, because the fur trade is still there, but it's much less important than the wood and the logging. Because let's say the British Navy needs wood, and so suddenly the Indians who were in good harmony with the French become very indifferent to them. They said they don't need them anymore. And for the Indians, it must have been difficult to understand why suddenly this changed. You see that we had good rapport before, and now they don't want us. Even you will have, at that moment, the beginning of these ideas you see among French Canadians. We are not, on n'est pas des sauvages. Right? We are not wild like these people. We are a cultivated nation. We have poets and things like that. And these people are uncultivated. They are wild. La notion de sauvage. And it's at that time that it becomes to be very popular to treat them like des sauvages, like people we don't want to associate with. And so then you have, in terms of psychoanalysis, I would say it's a kind of peculiar, so you said, if they don't like them, why they identify to them? It is, the identification, you could have a kind of, you can identify yourself to a hero that you admire and all that. But let's say you have a phenomenon of identification which is called melancholic identification. For instance, Freud gave this example. He says a child had a little cat and the cat died. And he says after 2 or 3 days, you see the little boy going on 4 paws and meowing and lapping his milk and all this, behaving like the cat that he have lost. There's an identification of something that you have lost. And that's why they call it melancholic identification, because it's not happy. But on the other hand, it's a way to deal with the separation. And then a third case in which you have a projective identification, I think this is the case, where you quit the other, but you project as if he was the one who quit you. Okay? You reverse the situation. So it's exactly what's happening with French, Canadian, and Indian at the time. They reproach the Indian to be the one who left them. In fact, it's the opposite. Because what I explained. So you see a little bit the context of this kind of identification done at the time with this painting. Okay, the painting went to England, as I told you, and then it became almost a myth, I would say, the painting itself. Why? Because there's a poet who's called Gagnon, François-Xavier Gagnon, a French-Canadian poet, who decided to make a poem which is called Le Dernier des Hurons. And he says, it's after having seen the picture of Plamondon that I decided to write this poem. Very good. And in the poem, he says, I wanted to express 2 things. A little bit of what he is in the painting there, but also the pleasure of revenge. Meaning that he wanted to express something else than just what we see here. And indeed, this identification with the other could be done differently. You could have a melancholic identification in which you feel bad, or you could say, no, it's about time that we take our revenge or take control of the situation and react to it. And you will see who understood that very well. Légaré did a painting at the time, and so Gagnon expressed these feelings in a poem, but Légaré made this painting, which is called, let's say, if you want, the title will be The Portrait of Joseph Hurons. Joseph, it's like the feminine form of Joseph. You add T at the end. And Hurons, O-U-R-N-E. Légaré, by Joseph Légaré. And Légaré was not the type of being too résigné. He was involved in everything that you could imagine during the 1837. He was with a more radical wing. He was even caught by and judged by Robert Symes, by the way, the same judge that I showed you before, and put in prison for 8 days. Anyway, Légaré was certainly a leftist and very much with the rebellion. And for him to show the Indians as résignés like this and looking uneven was impossible. So he decided to make what I would call a feminine version of the Dernier des Hurons. He make and if you go back to my 4 elements, you have first the face is no more résigné, is no more meditative. She's looking at you directly, and with an air of defiance, I would say, rather than of resignation and meditation. She has the same type of jewels also in the neck. Well, she's dressed like a woman at the time, but in her hands are not crossed like this. They are holding a fish, and they are holding some birds there. So she's seen as a hunter and a fisher of fish, and she's in the forest also. So it's as if you had a positive version of the Dernier des Hurons of Plamondon, as if you reverse all the parameters, and now you say instead of a man you have a woman, instead of meditative you have a defiance, instead of meditation you have defiance, instead of resignation you have action. You have something, and as if since the painting of Plamondon have disappeared, Légaré took a chance to put that there. But there was one feeling that was not yet expressed by the painting that was in the poem, in this painting, and it was in the poem of Gagnon. It was this idea of revenge, of a possibility of that the situation that we have could be reversed at a certain point. And I think Légaré wanted to express that, but in another painting, a very famous one, that is in the Museum of Quebec, that is called Le Paysage au Monument Wolf. The landscape with the wolf monument. You see him here in the middle. And it shows an Indian here with the monument of wolf, all without the inscription is there, but you cannot read it. And then on the other side, you have a canoe. I don't know if you see it well. It's here. And it's a painting that, how can I describe it? My colleagues and I have fought probably 20 years on the interpretation of it. Of course, since I'm here and they are not there, you will get my interpretation. But I will try to be fair and will tell you what they think about it. First of all, there's a discovery, it was interesting, that has been made by John Porter. At the time, he was an assistant curator at the museum, at the National Gallery in Ottawa. And he found in the collection of the Séminaire de Québec this engraving, and if you compare both, you will see, for instance, this tree here is here, all this foliage is here, everything, you have them, even the kind of very strange mountain for Canada. There's nothing to do with Laurentides, with the Laurentians. And all this landscape, in fact, comes from that engraving. The engraving is done by a Frenchman who's called Carlier, and I don't think it's a very important author, but anyway. And it is, in fact, a kind of mythological type of representation, because you have little personage here. Do you see a cow there somewhere? No? Yeah, okay. Because I'm too much on the side. I know she's there, so you should see it. And in the middle, you have a kind of a big man there, full of eyes. And finally, you have another one who plays a flute, who is Mercury, and the legend goes that way. Jupiter is the most, among the gods, is the one who have the biggest libido, as you know. So, and Juno don't like his little adventure, and Juno has transformed one of his girlfriend, Io, in a cow. This is a good way to take revenge, I guess, on the mistress of your husband. She will be a cow for you. Okay, and then the legend goes that, and then she give to keep the cow because she knows that Jupiter could have tricks of his own. And she gave a color series, it's called Argus, with 1,000 eyes. So he's able to see everything that could come nearby. So what is the trick of Jupiter? It's to send Mercury with a flute and to make these big colossus go to sleep, you see, and then to run with the cow, and then of course transform it back in what she was, a beautiful girl. Because for Jupiter this is not a problem, but the big problem is to get the cow. So this kind of legend, then we art historian. It's always incredible, but believe me, I tried to explain Christian iconography in Israel once, and I had the same feeling that it was very weird. You see, people were looking at me and said, "You must be crazy to believe in all these things." Anyway, let's say the interpretation says, okay, let's take advantage of this triangle in a way and try to see what it means in the painting of Légaré. For instance, the canoe take the place of the cow. This is what is coveted. And of course, then you could say, okay, the canoe could be a mean of transportation. It could be a symbol of the control of the resources of Canada. Let's say you could imagine that. So then the gesture of the Indian ear could be like Mercury trying to put asleep the giant, and by seemingly giving him homage to his victory. But the moment he will be sleeping, and he's already almost asleep since he's turned in stone, you will run away with the canoe and you will have the control of it. So when I was telling you that he wanted to express something of the poem of Gagnon, of this idea of revenge, you see how it can be interpreted that way. This was what my dear colleague Jean Trudel explained. So that's the way he put it. Then another one, who's called Robert de Rome, says, no, he's wrong. He says, look at the sequence of the thing. This one, what the Indian tried to do, is to seduce the wolf in order to get a control of it. So he changed the identification, let's say. One become Mercury here, and the other become Argus. Why? Because one of the newspaper of the time was called the Mercury, and it was the English newspaper of Quebec. So we thought, okay, maybe this could be interesting. Okay, and I did my little interpretation also. But the main problem I want to ask it is, when exactly the scene that we see here is represented? Oh, I forget one. I have to give homage to somebody else also. Didier Prioul, another art historian who is now teaching art history in Laval University, have discovered these engravings in which you see Vulcan giving his arms to Venus. Okay? So for him, and if you compare, of course, the Indian ear and the Vulcan ear, they are quite similar. So for him, this is clear. He says, okay, say the French Canadian who tried to seduce the English Venus. And, oh non, c'est l'inverse, c'est la Vénus. La Vénus anglaise qui tried to have seduced us by making us believe that we will be saved as a nation, and then have, in fact, being with perfidy, have suddenly changed her mind and proposed the union of the two Canada. So for him, not only Légaré would have borrowed the landscape to Carlier engraving, but he had borrowed also the two personages from this engraving of after Boucher, the famous French painter of the 18th century. So that's another thing. But if I go back to my interpretation here of this thing, I think the question we have to ask is when exactly the scene happens. And why I ask that? Because you have three hypotheses possible. It could be in the past. So then how to explain that there's a statue of Wolf who's there, who seems already almost crumbling. It could be the present represented allegorically, like all my colleagues have suggested, or we could be in the very far future when the only thing will remains from our time will be this kind of ridiculous statue, a little bit like in Kubrick's film. You remember the 2001, when you get this block of metal who falls among these people, these kind of very primitive monkey people, and they don't know what it is. It comes from another time. But the one who's living here is the Indian. Is as if he was coming back in the future in his forest, and he bring the forest with him, and he could afford now to make an homage to the old victor, let's say, of Wolf, who's represented there, and because now, of course, it's him who is in power. It's him who can have access to the canoe and do whatever. And why I say that? It is because the poem of Gagnon is exactly based on this idea. Gagnon says, will come a day when on these desert, you see, that we will have around us, the shepherd will not know what are the cinders that his feet are shaking. So when he will walk, he will see these cinders. He will not remember from what time it was. And it is a very typical romantic theme of the passing of the power. You see that for a certain period, some nations are in power, and then they disappear, they are replaced by another one, and everything could vanish like this, everything. So as much as you could say, well, the strong have destroy the weak, well, the weak may turn back in the very, very long future and destroy the ex-strong. So you could see that it could be interpreted in that way also. All these paintings that I've showed you, the Plamondon, Dernier des Hurons, this thing, in all of these paintings, we have always the feeling that the Indian is not there for himself. He's always a kind of symbol of the fate of the French Canadian. It's always a kind of this projective identification that you have with him. And one of the proof of that, if you compare the pose of this Canadien, it's written in big letters on the top there, a painting done by Légaré, and the pose of the Indians here, you would say are quite similar, in fact. Now, one is a little bit reversed, if you want, but it's the same type of pose. He's relaxed like this, sitting on the ground, and as if really this identification is done all the time. The things will begin to change when you could ask another question. Okay, this is very nice that the French Canadians identify themselves to the Indians, but how did the Indians saw themselves? What was did they feel they were the last of their race, that they were disappearing and all that? And it is so astonishing that in a way, Zachary Vincent, who was portrayed by Plamondon, became a painter. Who was his teacher? Plamondon, okay? And he made a self-portrait of himself with his son, which is not too bad for the last of Huron. If you are the last, you're not supposed to have any son. Not only he have a son, but he have 3 other children that we know of. He was married and he had 3 children. And indeed, you still have today Huron people, Wendat people, let's say, also in Lorette and elsewhere. And so, I guess what Zachary Vincent, who is the author of this thing here, called it autoportrait, and my son Cyprien. He gave the name of his Cyprien. Very often they have a French name in a way, that sounds French. They have their own name, but they were baptized Catholic, and the priest give them a French name, like Zachary or Cyprien, or things like that. And you see that in the portrait, Zachary Vincent have accumulated, I would say, all the signs that make him an Indian. For instance, you have, again, this big brooch. How do you say brooch? Brooch? In the middle. You have also a wampum here, along his, on his shoulder. You have this type of ornament, you see what I will show you. You have, of course, the axe. And the little child have a little ornament, the same thing, and he holds bow and arrows in his hands, as if he wanted to multiply these signs that we are not dead. We have a culture, but you don't represent us as we are, as we feel we are. And this is in a way quite pathetic, because later in his life, Zachary Vincent turned a very old man and very poor also, and he was making a living by painting his self-portrait like this. So what you see on the left is a kind of drawing that he made of himself, painting himself, and what you see on the right, it's a photo of him. And when you see how he's dressed, you see he has nothing of what he shows in his portrait. As if really the portrait is his soul, is what you want to show, what he is really, and not what the... autrement dit, it's like, I'm not just a symbol of your problem, you French Canadian. I'm also a culture of my own. And the pathetic aspect of it is that in fact he was poor. He was trying to sell these paintings to the tourists, and most of them are autoportraits, like this one, for instance, who have been reproduced in Russell Harper book, and where he's shown again with all these. I would say you will have, for instance, this armband here. And we do find these things in the ethnography now. For instance, in the Museum of Man in Hull, near the Musée de la Civilisation, you will find these objects. You see exactly. Like, for instance, the wampum, let's see, the crown that he have on his head will be like, so this is an example of this also. Always done by the silversmith for the trade, like I explained you before. That's their origin. And the wampum, well, I don't find exactly the same, but let's see, it gives you a good example of what it was. The more primitive one, or the more ancient one, let's say, were done with shell, with little piece of shell that were very skillfully pierced like this with just sand and kind of abrasive type of material, and they took a lot of time to do, and that's why you have these two colors. In fact, these are not tinted. In fact, it's or the top of the shell or in the inside of it with the mother of pearl type of effect. And so he wear that too. He wear this armband. He have this crown and all this, and it's all. And again, in contrast with what it does. And so you see when you oppose the two set of portraits, you realize that what the French Canadian painter did, it was to use the Indian as a symbol, and they could react. He could, at least Zachary Vincent, it's a kind of a contingency of history that served my purpose very well. He could himself affirm himself as a different culture. But this is not completely the end of the story. You will have, this is another portrait of Zachary Vincent that I forgot, done by Eugène Hamel. Eugène Hamel was the nephew of Théophile Hamel, who is more famous painter. This is Zachary Vincent, like an older man, if you want. But what I want to finish with, it is a few examples of a different kind. Okay, I spoke of identification of the French Canadian with the Indian, but there's a period also of disidentification, where they become to take distance with them and try to see them differently. And then a painter, at my eyes, who are very important for that process, is Théophile Hamel. Théophile Hamel, I've made this painting on the left here, who represent a jeune fille indienne, if you want, okay, an Indian girl. It's not a very convincing portrait. She is very, I would say, almost stereotype and all that. And see, she have very long hair, and she have also, okay, the symbols of see, the bow and arrows and the quiver and everything to look Indian. And why I put beside her the portrait of Jacques Cartier done by Théophile Hamel, because the two paintings were shown together. At least we know at two occasions the two paintings were hung together in the same room, let's see. As if Hamel wanted to say, the Indians I'm representing there is my fancy, let's say, about what an Indian woman could look like at the time of Cartier. Wow, this is very different then. If it's that, we're not completely sure that this is his intention, but if it's true, that means that suddenly you don't use the other as a symbol of your own faith. You're trying to be historical, to show things as they were. One sculptor who will feel something of that and will try to exploit this in a different way is Louis-Philippe Hébert. Louis-Philippe Hébert will have, at a certain moment, you live a lot in Paris and all that, and all team like this in Paris is very good for sales. If you are a sauvage à Paris, c'est formidable. Hein? Everybody looks at you. So he decided to make these little bronze like this. You see, they are not too high. Huh? They're about that size. And to sell them and to make money with that. And he thought the Indian team will be good. And what it is, in fact, he called this one Fleur des Bois. What it is, in fact, it's kind of, it always alludes to the fact that the girl is dreaming of a lover who is a white man. Huh? Fleur des Bois, c'est un peu ça. It's like because it's based also on poems, so you could give some content to it. For instance, you will have inscription here on the base where it will be said something, did the white man will not like the Algonquin hut? Did the white man will not? So what Hébert was alluding to, it was the métissage between the French and the Indians. And of course, in Paris this was good, but in Canada people didn't like too much this type of things. I don't know where. On n'est pas des métis, wait a minute, hein? We don't want to mix we are pas des sauvages, hein? Toujours this kind of obsession. But Hébert, who is a very academic sculptor and in a way could be less interesting, if you look carefully, you have always this type of implication. And I want to contrast it with a drawing with the same title, Fleur des Bois, also done by Suzor-Côté. And you see that Suzor-Côté have nothing to do with the finesse or the kind of innuendo that you have in Hébert. And I understood it when I saw the poor girl who posed for him. This is a photo taken in his studio, and she must be a nice French girl that he met on the street there. And he said, okay, behave like a sauvage. Alors she did her best, but she turned out not to be too convincing. And I want to show you a few examples of two other examples of Hébert. Again, this is the same idea, a kind of nostalgic side of she loses her French amant that disappear, and she's looking vaguely like this. This one is called Soupir du lac. Soupir du lac, comment est-ce qu'on peut traduire ça? Kind of dreaming on the lake or something. Another one is like this. This one is called Cœur qui chante, heart that sings. So it's all, but the allusion there, it's always that. But I will not finish with that. The other example that I wanted to show you, it's another painting by Hamel, in which again this kind of historical point of view is taking over. And when you can speak of a kind of decentrification of this identifying process, in which you begin to see things as they are and not like a projection of your own problem. What happened, it is a delegation of 3 Montagnais chiefs who came to Ottawa to Lord Elgin with a petition, and you see they have it in their hand, and they were accompanied by a man who's called MacLeod, who was, as you can imagine, Scottish by his father, but the mother was a Montagnais. So he was kind of close to the Montagnais people. They came from the Saguenay region. And why they came, what was their claim? It is at a time where precisely the company began to exploit the wood around them. And they were destroying the forest all around the Saguenay. One of the big company was Price Company, that was famous, and the creation of Chicoutimi and all these big cities there, it's about that time also. And the Montagnais were losing literally their source of living because the forest was destroyed. The trees, of course, were fantastic. The white pine that they cut at the time for the British Navy was extraordinary wood. And so that's why it was a good business, I guess, for these people, but it was catastrophic for the Montagnais. So they come to Lord Elgin with their petition, written in Montagnais, in English and French. And they had the chief, Thomas, this one, read it in Montagnais, and then MacLeod translated it in English and in French. So, and Lord Elgin is there listening to that, and he says, very well, he says, I will, he's the general governor at the time. And he says, well, très bien, I will speak to the Queen, and I will tell you what we can do for you. And the three chiefs says, that's it? He said, that's the thing you want to tell us? You don't have anything more to tell us, that you will speak to the queen? You don't understand we are almost dying? And then, okay, he realized that he made a mistake. And so he brings some medals, he gives them, you see them in their neck, and he gives them apparently each one a gun and a little flag, a British flag, and he says, I hope with this you will go back to you. And he says, no, he says, it's not enough. We need money, we need to save our people. And finally, apparently, with a lot of difficulty and all that, they got a little bit of money, but I could imagine this thing. And this bastardo of Lord Elgin said to them, the only things that is recalled, what he said to them, he says, you are a beautiful race physically, and I could imagine that you are as intelligent as you look. So it's not very different. And anyway, so what the importance of that painting, it is that it shows now an historical fact, something that happens, in which the Indians are represented in one of their fights for justice, if you want. It is very, very different from the point of view of Le Dernier des Hurons that I was presenting to you. It's no more a symbol. It is somebody who tried to depict facts as he saw it. And, okay, the previous image of this girl of the time of Jacques Cartier, you could say, well, it's not very successful because it's a kind of representation of history with a man who doesn't have really the tools to do it properly, you see, with archaeology or ethnology. But there, he could see them. And apparently, it's Lord Elgin himself that ordered a painting and went with it in... by the way, it was sometimes called Three Montagnais with Lord Elgin, but Elgin, we know his face, so he doesn't look at all like Monsieur MacLeod that you see here. This is a painting also done by Hamel of Lord Elgin. He was related to the famous Elgin of the marble of the Parthenon. It's the same family. And anyway, so this adventure of this third figure that I wanted to speak to you about, as you said, maybe it was a little bit complicated, but anyway, I think what you should keep in mind is this. First, you could use the other, let's see, like a kind of screen in which you project your own problem, or you could try to show it as it is, as another, as somebody else. And I think this is the big difference between the Plamondon approach and the Hamel approach that you have here. So I thank you. And next time we will change of period because I want to speak of Bordua and Pellan. So we'll make a big step. But since I want to finish with Michael Snow, I better go a little bit further. Thank you.